So don't tune me out. Turn to, you've got your Bible set, 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to look at verses 17, 18, and 19 this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17, 18, and 19. The Bible says, "Charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy, that they do good, that they," so he says, charge them. And he describes in verse 17. Now verse 18, here's the charge. "That they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate." Verse 19, "Laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." And I'm starting out this lesson. I want to kind of start out this way. You know, you got to wonder what was going through the mind of the Apostle Paul as he approaches the end. At least I have to wonder, as he approaches the end of this first letter to Timothy. Now we know he's going to write another letter, and there's at least some people believe that he wrote the first, and almost no sooner sent it out than he writes the second one. It may have been something like this. I'm not promising this, because history, especially Bible history, there's some things in there, you know, history that surrounds the Bible. There's some things that are left up to speculation and some study. We don't know everything. We don't know exactly how everything worked out just right. But here's the way it may have gone, and what I think is happening. The Apostle Paul is in a prison cell in Rome. And he is there being tried for his faith. He has given an answer to his faith, and he's already been before the court one time. And I think he knows, if his execution is not imminent in the first letter, I think he knows that there's at least the risk of that. So he writes the first letter. He writes to Timothy. He's got some instructions. He wants to give him some instructions about pastoring, about the work of the ministry. He gets that letter written and sent off, and just about the time, this is the way it may have gone, but about the time, not long after he sent out the first letter, the news is handed out. He's going to be executed. So he's written the first letter suspecting an execution. He writes the second letter as a follow-up, as a sequel, almost, and maybe one right after the other. We're not talking about years between them or anything like that, but maybe one letter, and he just immediately sends it off and starts to write the second letter. And in the second letter, because now he's writing because, well, he knows that his time is at hand. It's going to be any day now that he's going to be executed. The sentence has been handed down, and it's going to happen now that he's going to be executed. So he writes that second letter, you know, with more of a sense of urgency. I think there's urgency in the first letter, but maybe more so in the second one about his departing. So he's in prison. He's got to be aware in the first letter, he's got to be aware that unless the Lord does something very amazing, that his time on this earth is fast reaching its end. And he may have had, and again, he may have already had the plans in place for the second letter before he finishes this one. But I think what happens sometimes is we look at the first letter to Timothy, and we say, well, you know, these are all pastoral instructions. The second letter to Timothy is kind of like, you know, the last thing that he has to say. And I'd rather us think that as Paul finishes up, finalizes his first letter to Timothy in chapter 6, that these words are just as urgent to him and just as important to him as the last word he penned before his execution. He's writing the last words of this letter, and he's not like, when he comes to the end, he runs out of things to say. Pastor Caleb used to help out in children's church, junior church. And so he was working with Brother Wilder in there, and Brother Wilder, what Caleb would tell me is that Brother Wilder had this little thing that once, you know, got to be closing to noonish that time, that what he'd do is he'd have Caleb come out and listen through the speaker at me preaching. And Caleb could tell by the tone of my voice whether I was finished or not. Caleb could tell by the tone of my voice, you know, how close I was to done. So he'd come back and say, no, he's still, he's still working up to the crescendo here, or no, he's already on his landing, you know, and you got 5 minutes or whatever. And I don't think the Apostle Paul winds up on a crescendo and then works his way down to a landing in 1 Timothy. I think that every word that he's got to say in 1 Timothy, all the way down to the last one, are important words. And if that's the case, that every word is important here, and I think it is, then I think it's interesting that he chooses as his final 2 subjects in his first letter to Timothy, a letter on pastoring. I think it's interesting that he chooses as his final 2 subjects, one, a last warning for the rich, and secondly, a last word about vain babblings. That's what you find at the end of this letter. There is a warning to the rich, and then there is also another word about vain babblings, something that has come up repeatedly through this letter. So what I want to do today is we're going to just look at the first one of these, this warning to the rich. Then, the Lord willing, next week it'll be we'll look at his final word about vain babblings, and so I'm thinking about this, you know, warning to the rich, and what comes to my mind is I can see somebody right now just shut me off. That doesn't apply to me. I'm not rich. So this lesson isn't for me. Charge them that are rich in this world. Someone reads those words and say, okay, well, I can just scratch that out. That's not me. And so he's talking about someone entirely different than I am. And I don't think there's probably anyone in this room who thinks, I don't think any of us think of ourselves as rich, at least not the kind of rich that we would have warned about that we would think you need to be warned about. I don't think any of us think we're so rich that someone needs to say, now, you're so rich, you need to really be careful about your riches. And since none of us in this room think of ourselves as so rich that we're dangerously rich, I want to be careful today to warn you, don't tune me out. Say, okay, well, this doesn't have anything to do with me because I'm not dangerously rich by any means. So it doesn't. Just don't tune me out too soon. And I will admit, when we talk about wealth, especially we're getting close to March, which is Missions Month. And in the month of March, there is going to be an awful lot of talking about how rich we are as Americans. You know, the common things. Americans spend more on gum than many people in the world spend on their groceries. Americans spend more on dog food than we give to missions. And then when I see that one, I have to think about, and have you ever tried to feed a horse? And dog food is a piece of cake compared to feeding horses. And so, all of those kind of things, you know, Americans, we're going to talk a lot about being rich, and you know, and we are rich, and in this room, and I know over the years that I've pastored, I've talked to people about, you know, because that always comes up, and we as Americans, we are a rich people. Even when we're not rich, we're rich people, and someone will come up and say, well, I may have more money than a person in India has, but I don't have enough money to survive in America, or at least to survive well. And so I'll be the first one to admit that the subject of wealth can be a comparative kind of thing. It's relative. It may be true that I have more than 3/4 of the world's population does, but I also know that it requires more to live in our society than it does in many parts of the world. I know that that's true. I know that there are places in the world where people wake up and the only thing that interests them, that they wake up with one goal: how do I find enough food for today? And I know that that isn't often the case of someone in America, but I do also know that we do wake up and say, how am I going to pay my house, and how am I going to, you know, pay for my car? Because in the United States of America, it wouldn't be acceptable to have less than a certain standard of living. It just wouldn't. You'd be considered vagrant. It would be criminal in America to be so poor that you didn't know where you were going to get your food that day. And so I understand that that wealth is a relative thing. And the other thing I think it's important to realize, especially I was thinking about this in our area right here near the church. There are enough homeless people right here near our church. We see them on a regular basis. There are enough homeless people right here around our church to remind us that it wouldn't take that much to lose all that we have. So that a person could say, I may be more wealthy than someone in India or someone in a third world country, but I have to maintain a certain amount. I have to work a certain amount, save a certain amount. I have to budget a certain amount. I have to put aside a certain amount. I have to plan a certain amount, and I have to keep back a certain amount because it wouldn't be impossible for me to lose everything and be on the street. There are people that are on the street today that at one time weren't on the street. At least that's what they tell us. And so one of the problems that we have is that because we live with so much wealth, one of the things that happens with us, because we live with so much wealth all around us, that we forget that passages like this one apply to you and me as much as they do to the Donald Trumps and the Bill Gates of the world. I think here in the United States, it's possible for us to get so used to our wealth and thinking that, I have to have this much in order to survive in this world, that we can look at a passage like this and think, well, this passage only applies to the filthy rich. This passage only applies to people that are far beyond the kind of wealth that I have as a working person in the United States of America. So having said all that, just don't tune me out yet as we get into the lesson this morning. I want to show you, first of all, we're talking about a warning to the rich, a final warning to the rich. So let's start out, got to turn this thing on. Let's start out with a warning about attitude to the rich. He says, charge them that are rich in this world. He's going to talk to the rich, and I think you and I ought to consider this us. You and I ought to think that it's you and me that this passage is speaking about. And he says there's a warning here about attitude. He says, be not high-minded. Charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded. So let's just take a few minutes about that. The word high-minded is where it has to do with arrogance. Don't be arrogant. You've got a lot, so don't be arrogant. And those who are rich in this world need to guard against thinking to themselves as better than someone whose standard of living is less than theirs, which can happen. Webster's 1828 dictionary says this about high-mindedness or arrogance. It says, and I just like the phrase, so I wanted to use this. He says, that species, talking about arrogance, that species of pride which consists in exorbitant claims of rank, dignity, estimation, or power, or which exalts the worth or importance of the person to an undue degree. And I thought that was an interesting phrase, that species of pride. I don't see it often. I have one particular example. I won't mention too many details, but one particular example where a fellow that I pastored years ago, that it was in the church that I was a pastor of years ago, had started a business, and he started his own business, and he had succeeded pretty well in that business. He wasn't a college graduate. It wasn't someone that was born wealthy or anything. In fact, his business, if I told you what it was, it's kind of a it's not even, it would be less than a blue collar. You wouldn't even think it was a blue collar kind of job. No skill whatsoever involved in what he did. As far as, it's not like he had to get any kind of education to do this. The tools that it took to start this business were, under $100. And he had bought his less than $100 worth of tools and gone out and built a business that had made it where he lived in a very, very nice house and drove very, very nice brand new cars and thought himself better than anyone in the church who didn't have a car and a house as nice as his. And wasn't afraid to say so. I could do this. I started with nothing. I had nothing. I am nothing, or was nothing. I started with nothing, and I built it into something. That's because I am somebody. I have personal qualities that are better than people. And if you don't have what I have, it's because you're lazy, it's because you're no count, it's because you won't think, it's because, and he just, I mean, he was very upfront about that. If you don't have what I have, it's your fault. I have what I have after buying less than $100 worth of tools and just going out there and working hard. And if you want to work, and if you don't have what you need, you don't need me to give it to you. You need to get, and I won't say what he'd say, and get out there and go to work. And that's how he would look at that. And Paul says that you need to be real careful of that kind of attitude, of that kind of high-mindedness, of that species of pride that makes you think more of yourself than you should think. The Webster's 1828 dictionary goes on to say, it's still giving its definition of arrogance and high-mindedness, and goes on to say, it is a proud contempt of others. A contempt of others. An interesting statement. This fellow that I'm thinking of, I mean, he had a definite contempt of others. Even people who were Christians. If they didn't have as much as he had and were, you know, I mean, the last thing he thought is that he ought to try to help them, because if they wanted to, they could have everything that he had. All they had to do was work as hard as he worked, and those kind of things. And a proud contempt of others. And we've all seen it, you know, think about that fella. But most of the time, I think when we read this, charge them that are in this world that they be not high-minded. I think what we think of usually is those people who are represented in the lifestyles of the rich and the famous. You know, the Vanderbilts and Rothschilds kind of people who have their own section of the paper, so that they can gossip about one another, who's marrying who and who went to which party and those kinds of things. And they gossip about one another, and they snub people who aren't in the same class. In fact, they snub each other, but snub people who aren't in the same class that they are. But you know, the same attitude can be found in people who are not snooty, maybe, but they still think of themselves as maybe smarter or more athletic or harder working or maybe more motivated than somebody else, like this guy I was talking about, you know, thought of himself that way. And the bottom line is that we've got, all of us, we have to be careful that we do not think of ourselves as better than someone else. Regardless of our standing, and you know, it is not impossible that you and I look at our place in life and see someone else whose place in life we think is less than ours and think, I have what I have because I'm better at, or it might be I was raised better, or it might be whatever it's going to be. You know, I was educated better, or I went to this school and they didn't, or I graduated from school and they didn't. And I think we've got to be very careful that even in our church that we are not high-minded and think of ourselves as better than somebody else. The right attitude is to see all of the blessings that we have, to see ourselves as blessed. That would be to see ourselves as being blessed by God, to see the blessings that we have as being given to us by God, and that God gives them to us so that we can help others who are in need. That is the right way to think of our blessings, is that God has given them to us so that we have them to help someone who is in need. So there's, first of all, a warning about attitude. Then there's, secondly, I should have put that up, shouldn't I have? There's a warning about attitude. The right attitude is to see ourselves, our blessings as being given to us by God so that we can help those who are in need. And then there is a warning about faith. Verse 17, he goes on and says, now he's warning them, remember that God gave us all of these things richly to enjoy. And then he says that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. And so that transitions us from the first point to the second one. The right attitude is to see our blessings as being given to us from God so that we can meet the need, so that we can help others. If we've got it so that we can help someone who doesn't. And so then he goes on in verse 17, verse 17, and he says, be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. So he says, you need to be very careful that you don't trust in your riches, and which is an American problem, I think. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I think it's a problem in America. That we think like this: I have got to have this much set aside. I have got to have this much in the bank. And I've got to have this much in CDs and IRAs and whatever. I've got to have those things to protect my standard of living. And the Apostle Paul says you just need to warn them, Timothy, warn those that are rich that they don't trust in their riches. I'm not saying get rid of your bank, clear out your bank account. I'm not saying that. I'm not. Please don't take me. Don't take me to the extreme on this. My wife's good at that. She's not here today. I can get away with this. She's not here today, so you can't tell her what I told you. By next week, maybe you will have forgotten that I said it, what I'm saying today, and you will, because I know what happens. Every time I say my wife did this, and someone runs up right to her as soon as church gets over and said, you know what your husband said? And so she's not here for you to do that today too. So my wife is she's real good at this. She takes me to extremes. I say something, she takes that as like the letter of the law, and it takes it all the way to the extreme. And so don't take me to an extreme on this. Say, well, pastor told me I should clear out all my bank accounts. I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm telling you to do. I am saying that you shouldn't trust your bank account, your CDs and IRAs and all those kind of things. I am saying that if God ever told you, you know what, here's a need that you should give to, if God ever lays it on your heart and says, you know, you've got this, and here's a place it could be applied, that it would not be necessarily wise for you to say, God, I know that my money could be applied there, but I need it. If God says for you to apply it somewhere else, I'm suggesting that it'd be better to trust the Lord on that thing, give it and put it aside. God, I think, would tell us to have some aside and so that we can care for our families and so forth. But if God ever does say, in this area, here's a good time and a good opportunity and here's some place where you can divert this and put it into this need. If God ever says to do that, it'd be wise to do it. Rather than to say, God, I can't, I'd like to, God, but I need that in the account, and without that, I just don't know how I'll get by, God. If God says to give it, you better get rid of it, or God can take it out, as Pastor Bramley used to say, if you don't give it to God when He asks for it, He'll get it. It will be out of your skin instead of your account. So look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 13 through 15. He speaks to this idea of, so God gives to us so that we can help those in need. And he says, for I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened. That's not the point. It's not that we're going to put you in a position where now you're the one who's in need. But he says this, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality, as it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. So here's the thing. When we understand that God gave us those riches, we also understand that He can easily take them away. And so we trust Him and not the riches. We learn to put our faith in Him, and we have what we have so that it can be used for good. And if for whatever reason, and I got a little bit ahead of myself, I'm going to get to the good here in just a minute, I think. But we have what we have so that it can be used for good. And if right now, and if for whatever reason, God takes that away, we're no worse off without it than we are with it, because we still are, in either case, we're trusting God and not the riches. During the Great Depression, one of the interesting, one of the sad commentaries and sad statistics about the Great Depression is the number of suicides that happened among the rich. who lost everything in the stock market crash, but had no idea how to live, how to cope with life without those riches. They didn't have any idea how to do it. And I suggest to you that those who are living behind the bushes, behind Hagen's, used to be Albertsons, is Hagen's today, but it's going to be Albertsons again in another little bit, that the guys who are living back there are much better off than a person who was rich in the Depression and then lost it and didn't know what to do with himself. Paul told Timothy to warn them, neither one are doing well, because the people behind there, if they're not trusting the Lord, if they're not faithful to God, and most of them aren't, there's some issues there going on too. But I'm talking about as far as, you know, the dependence upon this wealth is not a healthy thing. Dependence upon money and bank accounts and all of that is not a healthy thing. So Paul told Timothy to warn them to put their trust in the living God and not in money and wealth and so forth. Notice the description that he gives here. He says, who giveth us, of God, he says, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. So now we come to the next screen. I think a person who trusts in the living God is rich, no matter how much or how little of this world's goods he may have. Doesn't matter. A person who trusts God is a rich person, even if they're living behind the Albertsons, if they trust God. Even if they just barely have enough food to eat. Even if they woke up today wondering where they were going to get food to make it through the day. They're rich people. I don't want to talk much about me. When we started the ministry, when Anita and I entered into the ministry in 1984, April of 1984, we moved to Astoria. I had $1,000 in my pocket. I did not have a job. I did not get support. I was talking to someone real recently about this. Something's changed in the last 30 years. When I started in the ministry, just planted a church in Astoria, it kind of was... you didn't even want to go get support. A church planter in the United States of America didn't want to get mission support, because if he took mission support, that was money that could not go to a foreign missionary, and a foreign missionary cannot work for his living. When I started out, that was kind of the thinking is that a guy planting a church in the United States of America needed to go to a town where God had called him. He'd get himself a job, do whatever he needed to get to survive in that town, and build a church so that he could support missionaries. But he didn't take missions money, because missionaries on foreign fields can't work. And if you can work to support yourself, you should work. That's kind of how So we went to town, $1,000 in our pocket that was given to us from the church that we were coming out of. We went to Astoria. Astoria was in a kind of not a low economic point at that period of time. There were no jobs. I couldn't find a job, and not at least right away. I wasn't able to find a job for about 9 months, and I wasn't able to find a job, and so for a period of time, Anita and I lived on some home-canned cherries that one of Anita's relatives gave us. They gave us like 3 or 4 cases of these cherries. They'd gone out and picked them and canned them. They were home-canned, and we had cherries for breakfast, and we had cherries for lunch, and we had cherries for dinner. That's what we ate for several weeks when we went to Astoria. Just cherries, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We didn't have anything else. That was all we had, is the only thing that we had to eat. Until after, I don't remember how many months it was, a young man who was in the Coast Guard started attending our church, and he was a single, 19 years old, single, and so what he did is he said he was missing home, so he gave us his food allowance, and he went out of the rest of his income. He bought his breakfast and lunch, and then he gave us his food allowance. In exchange, he came to our house and ate dinner every night, and we ate for near a year. On just the money that he gave us. We wouldn't have eaten anything after that. Well, anyway, so I'm getting off the subject. I will tell you this. When I look back at those times, my wife and I, when we talk about those times, we don't think, boy, we were poor. We think, boy, we were rich. We were serving the Lord. We had gone to plant this church, and we saw things happen that were unbelievable miracles. It was during that period of time that I came to the conviction that I don't need to worry about money. When I have a need, and it is a real need, God makes sure the need gets met. And it was during that period of time, because when the cherries ran out, Kelly came and gave us his food meal allowance, and when that ran out, there was another, and everything that we ever needed we had. And we don't look back and say, boy, you know, we were so poor then. We don't think that way. In fact, I look at it now and say, how in the world did we do some? You know, we made a 4-hour trip to Eugene, Springfield every month to visit my mother and father-in-law, and I'm thinking today, I can't afford to make a trip to go visit my parents now. How did I afford it then? And I know you say, well, it was because of Anita's parents. Anita's mom would buy us underwear. Every trip we went, she'd buy underwear for us, which you just had no idea how much money that'll save when someone buys your underwear. Anyway, she would buy our underwear for us, but her father wouldn't, my father-in-law wouldn't have given us gas money to get home and back to save his life. I mean, he thought he would write, every time he came to visit, he'd write a $10 check to Anita and put it in the offering plate. I wanted to just, and like that. First of all, I can't give it to her. You're not going to be able to claim this as a church, we're not going to put this on your giving slip, a check to my wife. We're not going to do that anyway, so he never would give to things, but God always met our needs. Anyway, so what I'm just saying is, if you are trusting God, if you trust God, you don't need a lot to be rich. All right, so finally, I got to get done here. I'm already, see, a warning about charity. Yeah, warning about charity, verse 18. So he says that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. And then, so real quick, I'm getting way behind myself there, way ahead of myself there. So we go right back, and we read this. We go right back to 2 Corinthians 8, verses 13 through 15. And I want to read it again. For I mean not that other men be eased, and ye burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may be a supply of their want, and that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be an equality, as it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. So we ought to view our advantages as opportunities to do good. That's how we ought to view our advantages. Not as I'm better than him, but as opportunities to do good. Again, we'll be looking at missions next month. It's an missions. We in America are so rich, and so what happens is once a year we get together and we say, let's organize our opportunity to do good for missions around the world, helping missionaries take the gospel around the world. You can't hardly do much better than that. And finally, I'll get done here. He says there's a warning about eternity. And that's verse 19, not verse 18, verse 19, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. So the word warning may seem funny when it's talking about, may not seem like the right thing when you're talking about, heaven, warning about heaven. But I think warning is the right word. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, the Lord Jesus Christ says this. He says, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Doesn't that sound like a warning? Hey, don't do this with your income. Don't take your treasures and put them here. If you put them here, it's just going to spoil. Put them here instead. The Bible warns us not to put too much stock in this world, and so that our hearts, our hopes, our homes are supposed to be in heaven. That's where we're supposed to be looking. So Paul, he's almost finished this letter to Timothy, but he's far from finished with his message, so you don't want to give up on Paul yet. He's got one more really good message for us in this book, and the Lord willing, we'll see that next week.